Here is Vinta Mermaid Green. This is a very light, desaturated green. And at first blush in a writing sample, you might think this green really comes kind of gray, but the chromatography will show the truth, as does the swatch. Desaturated makes sense with this aquatic name of the ink. In general, it holds close in tone as we change papers and has a generous amount of gentle shading. Stop and just look and you see the deliberate seafoam green of this ink. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, there is no sign of aggression. No birds of any kind, no additional girth to the lines, no real spread going on. I can't say that this calls to me at all, but I use this as a secondary color in some of my note taking, and it worked perfectly fine for that. So I do see a very useful, use in this daily writing for this ink, just not as a primary ink for me.
The pen for today is a Noodler's Ahab. And now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we're getting that lovely seafoam green that has that hint of almost looking like it could be a gray. This came from my fingers from a later writing that transferred over, unfortunate with that. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade very gently in and out of it. Right here at right, you see it starts nice and light, works its way darker all the way through the entire word till it gets to its darkest at the T at the end. Now, it can be helpful shading in the middle at times, like the unhelpful, the H is a little bit darker than the EL, the P darkens up a little bit, the FU lightens up some, and the L at the end does get a little bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, no problem writing back here.
Vinta makes more than just one ink. So let's take a look at a few other inks from Vinta.
Here is Vinta Terracotta de Milli. Here is Vinta Mulberry Ubi. Here is Vinta Romblon. Here is Vinta Sandugo.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade very well. Take a look at But, where it starts a little bit lighter with the BU, much darker with the T at the end, just as we might expect looking at Just on the first line, where the J is a nice mid-tone, lightens up to the us in the middle, T at the end being quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting, and would have no problem continuing our notes back here.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors, making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
The tone we're getting here is a little bit lighter, but a little bit more pronounced green, pronounced seafoam green, a little bit better a tone, I think, on this paper, showing this as slightly translucent ink. Now, it doesn't feather, doesn't spread. I do have to hand it to them. It shades well. Take a look at hand on the first line, where the H is darker. The N in the middle does get a bit lighter, and that D at the end during the downstroke, quite a bit darker. Following exactly what we would expect. Look at following. The FOL, nice and light, dark a little bit more on the second L, lightening through the O into the WING at the end, much darker. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem with bleeding or ghosting, letting you continue your notes back here.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does shade not as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but it does not stand out well against the quad rule. It really gets lost in what's going on. It blends with the quad rule, making this a bit harder to read. Not something I would suggest if this is the type of paper that you prefer. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. Great if you like writing on both sides of the page.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more green inks. Here is Califolio Vert. Here is Caran d'Ache Delicate Green. Here is Diamine Jade Green. Here is Levenger Gemstone Green. All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Here we see the tone is just a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine, flatter as a tone as well. It doesn't feather, doesn't spread. It does shade indeed. Take a look at indeed on the first line, where the indeed is fairly light. The downstroke of that D at the end does get a little bit darker. But in Baltimore, the word on the page, not the location. You don't have to go all the way to Baltimore to see this. You do get a little bit better shading where the B shows a little mid and light tones. Light into the A, slightly darker at the L, slightly darker at the T, slightly darker into the I, the M-O-R, nice and light with a dark E at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding, no ghosting. It would be good for use for a student if it wasn't so light. I would not recommend this for student use because of how light the tone is.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page. Here is Zenzoi Juicy Orange. Here is Scribo Notturno Viola. Here is Lamy Black. Here is Diamine Red Luster. The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
The tone we're getting on the page is just a little bit lighter, just a little bit flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread. It does have little bits of shading that can be adopted throughout the writing. Take a look at adopted on the second line, where the A is lighter than the D. Keeps a little, about the same with the O, P. The T lightens just a little bit into the E and beginning of the D. It's that downstroke of the D that we get to see some of those dark tones again. I would say that this is not my optimal look for on this paper, but it certainly would work. So if you do use the 20-pound copy paper, this doesn't seem so bad. Looking at the back of the page, you see that it does get deep into the paper, meaning you probably couldn't write on both sides. However, it does not bleed through, touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The Noodler's Ahab has a very wet flex nib, and still the tone is very light. Good there was some flex, because sometimes the light tone just gets you to want to push harder for no good reason as you write. Feels like you're not putting down enough ink. Off camera, I felt masochistic. So I tried this in a dry fine, and trying to read it almost made my eyes bleed. I would say this is fair that no matter what pen you put this in, the pen should be a gusher. Put the ink down like it's a Zamboni putting water on ice, because otherwise I'm not sure how well you're going to be able to read what you write, unless you're trying to write messages that almost disappear like it's a secret code.